Okay, so I put this up yesterday, and we sort of had some intuitions why things would change, and at this point we've built it up through 3 different lectures, so hopefully you get a sense that things are very different at different scales. And then I went on the board and tried to give you sort of like very short crash course on turbulence, because it might be something that you're scared of, and I would like you to have a very pictorial view and very simple arguments that show you how different flows are when they are turbulent versus not. And this will be the key for what I'll show you next, and it will bridge the gap between simple gradient climbing algorithms that you can do at small scales and more complex algorithms that you need at large scales because of chaos. You need to infer things in a chaotic environment where there is uncertainty. So this is where we are. We are trying to understand the physics of turbulence to see how that then translates into algorithms for navigation. Okay, so I'm gonna try and keep this short so I can get you to some movies and some nice stuff. Okay, so we were here yesterday. We had this pictorial view of turbulence where you inject energy at large scales. So L is injection of energy, and then this energy would be transferred towards small scales through the entire inertial range and would be dissipated at eta, Kolmogorov scale, okay, through diffusion. And this very simple image gets us very far, in fact, and I started yesterday. How far does it get us? Well, we have to start with the Navier-Stokes equations, and hopefully by now you've seen them enough that they're not too weird. Okay? Okay? And the one thing that we got just from scaling arguments, okay, just by saying this term is just stirring energy and transferring energy from the large scales to the small scales, we got, you remember, that separation of scale goes as Reynolds to the 3/4. So turbulence equal, you inject energy at large scale, you dissipate it at small scales. Okay? This has a lot of implications that I'll try to keep myself from telling you, but there's a lot of deep stuff in here. Okay? We're just going to keep it simple. Then the second thing that this implies is the following thing. So the central object that we're talking about are velocity differences. Okay, and we introduced this notation that was very weird because it looks like a derivative, but it's not a derivative. Not a derivative. It's just the difference of velocities at scale r. So you take the velocity in one position and you subtract it to the velocity in another position. That's a distance r. You take the absolute value, although this is not exactly right, but let's keep it simple, okay? And this for homogeneous isotropic turbulence in 3 dimensions, it's only going to depend on the absolute value of r, okay? Doesn't depend on direction. Okay, so this is the central object, and people go after the probability distribution of this object. Okay, we've done some scaling arguments, trying to understand how balancing these terms, how far does it get us? Another result, which is of this, of similar kind, and I want to show it to you because everybody talks about this, and maybe this will come back later in your career and you won't be petrified by it. Exactly. So there is a mathematical identity that says if you take an object like that, or like the correlation functions, okay, so let's call it, so there are two equivalent ways of talking about that. You either think about the differences, so these are called the structure functions. Is it this?
Yeah, it's feedback. There's too much feedback. Is it possible to reduce the volume? There's too much feedback. Is it possible to reduce the volume of the microphone?
Okay, so this is exactly this. So in our notation, this is VR to the P. Or equivalently, one can talk about the correlation functions.
Yeah, I think it's better.
Can you still hear?
It needs to go up a little more.
There's a soft spot.
I'll keep going now.
Can you say something?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Is it okay sound?
We can hear, but we're on the phone.
Okay. And that's it. See. Okay, so in turbulence, you go back and forth a lot between structure functions and correlation functions. Okay, so don't be weirded about it. There's relationships between them. Okay, so one mathematical identity is that if you have a correlation function, okay, if you have a correlation function and then you do its Fourier transform, you can think about an object which is called the spectrum of the Fourier transform. And the spectrum has scaling properties that are related to how this behaves in real space. Okay, this is just a mathematical identity. You can imagine, you can calculate it. Okay, and the scaling for this goes like this. And I'm gonna just give it as a black box because it's a classic result. Okay, this is called the spectrum. And for us, it will be the energy spectrum, because we're going to talk about correlation functions for velocities. Okay, this is defined as the 3D Fourier transform over a shell. Okay. Okay, so you take the 2-point correlation function and then you do the Fourier transform, and this is what the spectrum is. Okay, and there is a relationship which is basic, which is if, so I'll write it directly for the 2-point correlation function. This guy.
No, there is an
R.
before the Fourier transform.
Ah, sorry, this must be K. Okay, so this is mathematical relation, so I'm not going to discuss it. But now we know what this n is just by our very simple scaling argument, which I have not repeated here, but we can repeat it very easily. We multiply this equation by v, and we are assuming that this term is constant throughout the inertial range. So you get 3 velocity differences, okay, and then you have one distance at the denominator. So that says drv cubed divided r about constant. Okay, and this was our energy dissipation rate. So how much is this? DRV will be r to the 1/3, so square is 2/3. Okay, great. So this tells you that if we assume that simple scaling, so again, we're just drawing consequences from our very simple assumption and pictorial view of how this is working. If we assume that that scaling is right, then we know how the velocity differences scale at different scale r, which is this r to the 2/3. These are the squares, okay? And this tells us that this is 5/3, okay? Because n is 2/3 plus 1, 5/3. The spectrum in a turbulent field will be k to the minus 5/3, okay? Okay, so this is all very nice, but turbulence is much more than this, and I'm not going to tell you very complicated things, but just one very, very interesting and intriguing thing about turbulent fields is that all of this gets us very far, but not to the very end. And the reason is, if you assume that everything is self-similar, here scaling arguments mean I don't really care about details of how things look at different scales. I'm assuming, for example, in going from here to here, I'm saying that the second order and the third order moments will just scale with respect to each other. Okay, so underlying all of these arguments is self-similarity. Self-similarity means that if you take a signal, and turbulent signals, maybe I should show you some turbulent signal, okay? Turbulent signals look like this. So if you take a little part of this domain and you zoom in and you keep zooming in, they kind of look the same. This is like any fractal will be like that. Self-similarity is defined by if you look at smaller scales, they look similar, okay? So if you do that assumption, then these arguments will tell us how the higher moments go. And actually, so here.
So maybe the question about self-similarity
Yes.
is, you know, because this is very much exploited in turbulence, right?
Yeah.
But is it just sort of a leap of faith, or is there any argument that you can?
It is wrong.
Okay.
It's not like it's the best assumption you can make to do everything as simple as you can.
Yeah.
But then the you know, the super interesting things about turbulence are exactly where this breaks down. Yeah. So I'm just.
What's at least the, like, why did anybody think it could be right?
Well, because if you think about if you do scaling arguments around here and they work, then that's the natural thing to think, right? I mean, you're doing this. There's no. This is universal. This is the assumption, right? They underlie it. This is universal. You push L to infinity, eta to 0. Nothing depends on anything. So there's, you know, so there's no scale. This is scale free. So it's quite natural to do, right? Because again, this is all in the limit where Reynolds is very large. Okay, and so if you think about infinite Reynolds, then here you don't have scales anymore. Okay. But this breaks down, and it breaks down in a very interesting way, which will be interesting for our navigation problem. So as I said, if all moments scale, if we can keep going with this with all moments, then, okay, so let's get to probability distribution. So differences at a scale r, let's say that this is the probability distribution of differences at the scale r, okay? And let's say that this is a certain distance, and we'll take it in between the inertial range, okay? So we'll say this is at r 1, and then let's go at r 2, okay? Okay, and let's look at this. The variance of this probability distribution is increasing with the distance, correct? Okay, so if R2 is larger than R1, these two probabilities look like this. R2 is larger, is broader than the differences at R1, correct? Okay, so this is just one moment, okay? I can ask myself, what about the shape of this distribution? Okay, and one assumption that I can make, which I've been telling you throughout, is maybe I can assume that this is self-similar. And in other words, I can assume that if I rescale this by its standard deviation, this will collapse onto each other. Does that make sense to everybody? This is a concept, and it's really important. So please, if this doesn't make sense, interrupt me. Ask stupid questions, profound questions, whatever question you want to ask. Okay, so now if I divide by, let's call it sigma, or whatever, each one by its own sigma, then does it look like this? Do they rescale? Do they collapse onto each other? Okay, if they do, then all of the moments will scale. Okay, just by simply if you rescale everything and everything collapse, all of the moments will collapse. So that means that this will be carried on at all orders. Correct? So number one, if yes, then you can make a simple scaling argument and say that all of the structure functions or all of the moments Sp of R will be about S2 of R to the power P. Actually, let's do 2P. Okay? So that means that if S2 is 2/3, S2P will be R to the P 2P3. Okay? Whatever order you're looking at, you have to multiply it. Correct? Okay, so this is a plot of, these are called scaling exponents. And this is our prediction. P3 is self-similarity.
So P1 or P2?
Well, I'm doing 2P and it's 2P3, so if you do P, it's P3. Okay? Are we all on board? Okay. Experimental evidence. Actually, for number 3, this is exact. And then they deviate. Okay, what does this mean? I remind you, the argument is everything is self-similar. I know the first order moments, the first and the second. Then I know everything else if it's really self-similar, which means the PDFs have the same shape. And then the prediction is that the scaling exponents, which are now these guys, so the exponent by which you have to not multiply but exponentiate R, okay, these are the scaling exponents, should be linear. If I don't see them linear, what do I infer?
We have problems with the dates of the distribution.
Great. Okay, they don't look like this. If you rescale them, they'll have a different shape. And invariably, one will be higher here and higher there. Okay, so the tails will be higher. This is what's called intermittency. If you look at that field at smaller and smaller scales, although it would be reasonable to think that it's scale invariant, in fact it's not. And if you look close enough, then there's a high probability of large fluctuations and of very small fluctuations. That means that it's sort of like either there's nothing going on or a strong cliff. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I make a pedagogical comment? So this is very helpful because next week you're going to have Andrew Magla, who will probably use a lot of these concepts of correlation functions and structure functions in gene regulatory network and biochemical reactions. And there's also exactly the same concept of intermittency, which is linked to gene bursting.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see this again in another context.
Okay. Nice. So I'm going to conclude in very few minutes, but I just want to say, how does all of this translate for a scalar that's transported by this velocity field? Okay? And how does the equation for a passive scalar looks like? Passive means it doesn't act on the velocity field. I've written this over and over, so I'm not going to pester you, tell me how it is, but please shout if this makes no sense to you. Okay? Okay, so this is the diffusivity. And this is the advecting velocity field.
Can you give us an example of a scalar field which would be
Odor, a chemical. Temperature, if it doesn't vary too much. If it varies a lot, then it affects the velocity field and it's not passive anymore, it becomes active. Okay, so that changes the picture. Any tracer that's dispersed in a fluid, okay, anything that doesn't affect the fluid velocity. We've talked about this at very small Pickley numbers where I took this away, I completely neglected it, and that was diffusion. Now we're at high Reynolds number, large velocities, large spatial scales, and so we can't put that under the rug, but we've done some, we've progressed a little bit on the velocity. Do we have the same phenomenology? The fantastic thing about passive scalars is that although this is a completely linear equation, okay, this term is funky enough that it will produce all of the phenomenology that I just told you, even if it's not really nonlinear in theta. Okay? Not only this, it will do it even if V is not a turbulent field. This is magic. Right? So let me summarize what this will do for our scalar. Did I say everything? Yes. Okay, so now let's translate what we just did for the velocity for the scalar. Okay? This is our PDF of the fluctuations of the scalar at the scale r, and this is the PDF at a smaller scale. Okay? It has intermittency. It shows intermittency. It shows intermittency even more dramatically than the velocity field. It shows something that is called saturation of the exponents. So this is how it looked like for the velocity. And for the scalar, it's something similar initially, and then it saturates. Saturation for scalar. You can demonstrate that if these exponents saturate to a constant, then the fine scale structure of your field is really composed of ramps and cliffs. It's almost discontinuous. It means that if you look at small enough scales, you'll have huge gradients. Okay, the structure here is made of ramps and cliffs. Okay, so there are sort of fronts. The width of these fronts comes just from diffusion. You smear it out just a little bit. Otherwise, it would almost be discontinuous. So I want to say just two things about this equation, because I'm not going to do any calculation, but you can do a lot of stuff, and those led to major advances in this field. One thing you can do, as I said, is you don't really need V to be the full numerical solution of the 3D Navier-Stokes equations. You can assume that V is a random field, delta correlated in time. You don't need correlations in time. And then you have to assume that its spatial structure resembles what it looks like in a real turbulent field. Okay, this is called the Kriknan model.
So can you tell them why Kriknan is also famous in the sociology of science? Do you know that story?
No, he worked. He was working at home.
Yeah, he worked in New Hampshire
Yeah.
in his hut, but he's also credited with saying that in each turbulence paper there should be a line which says the cheat occurs here.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Which I think is generally true for all.
For any paper, yeah. I agree. Okay, this was major, because imagine, so right now we're talking about a field that's advected by a mass, like something that you cannot calculate analytically, that you need huge computers to do simulations over. And now suddenly you can write down a stochastic model where V is just drawn by a Gaussian distribution. You just have to assume that it has specific correlations, which I'm not even gonna write up because they won't make any sense for you, but it just needs to have spatial correlations, no time correlations, so that's really important. So the velocity, so S2 of R, okay, so our correlations, our structure function for the velocity have to have some specific functional form, okay, that reproduces some kind of non-trivial scaling, some kind of crosstalk at large scales, okay, otherwise you don't get anything. But then you can assume that it is delta correlated in time. And if you do this, you can calculate a lot of stuff. In particular, you can get intermittency as zero modes, right? So we just had this brilliant lectures, and we grasped all of the importance of zero modes. Zero modes here are really important too, because what they tell you is, why do you miss something? Like conceptually, why can I not just make a scaling argument here? Why does it fail? Do you know? Even in a linear system, what does it mean, a scaling argument? Let's say that you have a linear system, a linear partial differential equation, L of x, and then there is a term on the right-hand side. A scaling argument would be L scales like f, right? But the solution of a linear system contains also zero modes, right? The complete solution of the linear system will be a specific solution of the full problem plus an arbitrary combination of zero modes. Those zero modes are obtained through L of x equals 0. So they won't follow your scaling argument. Okay, so none of your zero modes will follow any of this. And so the zero modes are at the origin of anomalous scaling and intermittency in turbulence. Okay, very conceptual level, but you can calculate. Okay. Second thing I want to say, and then we'll move to mice, is the Lagrangian framework. This is a little bit, actually a lot, not a little bit, like the analogy I proposed to you between random walkers and the diffusion equation. Okay? So you can always look at a system from a Lagrangian or an Eulerian point of view. You've seen that over and over and over. Okay? And so by thinking about how a particle would move into this field, you can reconstruct all of the statistics of your field. Okay? The central object there, so this is standard, so maybe I'm not even sure that I should write it down because it's the standard Lagrangian, or maybe I should. Okay, let me write it down. So theta will vary along the trajectory by the source term, so whatever is this, along that trajectory. Okay, and this is accounted for in there. Okay, the trajectory will have to account for both advection and diffusion. So the Lagrangian trajectory here will follow the following equation. And again, now you sort of understand that if I add a white noise, that will give me a diffusive process. Okay, and then I have also advection. And this notation means that I have to evolve the trajectory rho depending on the value of the velocity field, which is an Eulerian field, calculated where the particle is at that time. Okay, so this is the reason why I cannot write v of t, because v is a field, so I need to tell it also where I'm calculating. Okay, so this is all standard. I can then reconstruct what theta is through, oh, and now here you won't see unless I do this, okay, through the green function, okay? It's called propagator actually. Okay, and I'll comment it in a second. This is the central object that you would be interested into. So if you wanted to go this way, you could, for example, do a simulation, look at where the particles are going, and then write down this probability, which is, it's called a propagator, and it's the probability that a particle starting at r prime t prime will end up at r at time t. Okay, you do this integral and you reconstruct your field. I'm not going to do calculations, but this is the way that you can do a lot of stuff. And yes?
Would you mind just saying that again, the interpretation?
This guy?
Yeah.
So you can reconstruct the value of your scalar field at position r time t. Sorry, r is now, it's not a difference. R is a location in space, huh? Was that the confusion? Sorry. I slightly... Okay, we have talked about differences there. Here we are talking about a point in space. Okay? So now you can see that you can reconstruct any statistical quantity just by looking at this propagator. And if you want to look at the 2 points, then you'll need to know how 2 particles move. And if you want to look at the endpoint correlations, then you'll have to know how endpoints will move relative to each other. Okay, so this gives you a sort of geometric interpretation too. You think about pairs, about triplets, and you think about how their relative motion is, and you can go pretty far apart. Okay, so one thing you can do is you can simulate these trajectories, and the other thing you can do is you can try and make a stochastic model for how these trajectories will look like. And there's beautiful work, that's just a second, that's highly relevant to us about how would you calculate the statistics of an odor plume at large distances. Okay, so that's the last thing I want to say.
Do you have an example of where you can get these Green's functions analytically?
Analytically, for the Kraichnan model, you can do it.
For example,
Diffusion is
Oh yeah, not for turbulence, yeah, for diffusion. That would be
I'm
the...
talking about turbulence. So
For turbulence, I'm only aware about the Krakener model, but that's pretty powerful. The only thing, so it will get you pretty much anything, but there will be a parameter, and that parameter is free in the Krakener model. So it's kind of abstract, because then it agrees with the observations if you assume that that parameter is something. But since that's a made-up parameter, it's not like you have a handle on it.
I think what you do in practice is you make approximations to G, right? Because of course the devil is buried in the propagator,
Right.
so you can do mode coupling expansions,
Yeah.
which is a popular indoor sport, and I mean that's what a lot of people do, right?
Yeah, so
Expand in wavelengths and then see how they couple.
yeah, so maybe this is the right point to say what they did for. Actually, I'm not gonna discuss it, but you can think about how this would help you in the case where your field, and we are gonna talk about order fields, would be. So we've talked there about our picture is very continuous, like everything. I'm putting things in at a large scale, right? And I can do that, but I can also have point sources and look at them as they are as point sources of a scalar. So let's think about how a point source would develop in space of scalar field. So we'll talk about order. Develops in space and time. And so you have to adapt those arguments because it's not an extended forcing that you have, and this is the correct formalism where you can think about that. Okay? And through that formalism, it was shown very recently, and you get Massimo next week, so you can ask him a lot of stuff about this. You can get essentially asymptotic expansions of how things will look like at large distance from your point source when the order is advected by a turbulent field. Okay? And what it looks like qualitatively, and this has been observed over and over by entomologists, for example, that look how moths find the source of an odor, which would mean the female. Okay? It's been observed that as close to the source you have this filament, and then the filament breaks down, and then eventually you have only discrete patches of odor. Okay? So you can imagine, so here I'm transitioning to something that is very relevant for olfactory searches, and you can see the progression. We've started with small scales where we had gradients and everything was smooth. Okay? And that's enough to do gradient climbing. We've moved to large scales where we've seen that a continuous field, a large scale field, will be highly fluctuating and intermittent. And now we're moving to a situation where not only you have intermittency in the scalar differences, okay, so that's a fine property of your scalar, you just won't get any signal for a long time because there are zeros all over the place. Okay? So in order to get this, you use that second formalism. And this is an extreme version of an olfactory search problem. So now I just want to draw your attention on, yes?
So what you mean is that in intermittency there's no discontinuity, but in this case there can be discontinuity.
Yeah, I mean if you have a source of scalar that's distributed in space, you won't have zeros. You have these dramatic fluctuations, but you probably won't have zeros because zeros is... In this case, you do have zeros, and the reason is very simple. It's because you are, so the way to think about this is you are emitting odor, and this odor is transported in these patches, which are originally very concentrated, and then they increase in size, and then they keep increasing in size, and at some point you just have that the concentration is so low it wouldn't be detectable by any device. Okay, and you can calculate this, and it's important because you have to demonstrate that these are zeros actually by any reasonable means. Okay, okay, so I just wanted to pause for a second because conceptually this is sort of like one of the take-home messages of this course is if you are interested in navigation, and remember, we started by talking about navigation in a very global, comprehensive way that would have biases, would have ways of computing trajectories. Now we're only talking about the sensory part of navigation, right? That's the only part that we have looked at in some detail. And the sensory part means how do I find the source of an odor or the maximum of an odor in a fluid environment. And we've gone through scales. We've done it at small scales. So if you know that you are at small scales and you know that Reynolds is small, Peclet is small, then gradient climbing is a good option. Okay, and then we were trying to understand whether for elephants would be the same, and we had this discussion yesterday and we were like, no, it's not going to be the same because at large scales there are weird fluctuations, and now we know something more about what weird means. They are intermittent, they are wild, they scale like R, so they are huge fluctuations. Okay, but we have a branching decision tree, right? We are at large scales, things will be weird, but we still have a choice. If we are in that situation, so if we are within the plume, or in other words, close to the source, at least we have a fluctuating signal, okay? Okay, so we can deal with randomness, right? We all love statistical physics. We can do that. This is really extreme, right? Because not only the thing that you'll get will be random, so fluctuations, so if we are far away from the source, this is really wild. No signal for a long time. And then when you do get the signal, for example, gradients will be completely useless, right? They'll point to the center of this puffs. Okay, so this is sort of like, we could say that this is information limited, although I want to point you out to some really nice result. Information limited. And I'll put it in quote because it's vague, okay? And then I wanted to say another thing, but it's slipping my mind. It will come back probably, maybe. Okay, it's gone. Okay, so just one thing I want to say, and then we'll really move to the mice, is that in this regime, okay, there is a lot of nice work that looks into how to build an algorithm that would find the source of an odor. Okay, and one of the most famous algorithm that's been invented by Massimo, who will be here next week, is called Infotaxes. Okay, this is an algorithm that instead of climbing the gradient of the odor itself, because we've seen that would be completely crazy to do in a situation like that, it climbs the gradient of information acquisition. Okay, and information is information about the location of the source. So it's defined in terms of the probability, your bias, your map of probability distributions that tell you how probable it is that the source is in a certain location in space. And then at each acquisition of an order signal, you update this map, and then you climb that gradient. There's really no guarantee that that information is the right one. It works really well, and it's beautiful. But the question which is really deep here is, what is your goal in this situation? The goal is to find the source of the odor. The goal is not to acquire information, right? So depending on the kind of information that you acquire, maybe that could be a proxy for your goal, and sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. So I'm just gonna, this is very hand-wavy, but they have done really beautiful work showing that as a function of what information you're after, for example, in two-armed bandits problem, you will do good or you'll do very bad. Okay, so it's just to say that these concepts are sometimes super useful, and sometimes they leave us with a little bit of bitter sour feeling, because there's no way we know whether information is a good proxy for what we need to do. Okay, I just wanted to point it out.
Give an example of when Infotaxes works and when it fails.
Infotaxes work. So in these situations, it works beautifully. When you really are at distant scales, so you don't have signal, it works beautifully. So this is
But are there some examples at large scales where it will fail, or?
I'm not aware of that. No, I think this works beautifully. What I want to point out is that there's no guarantee that it would. And in particular, for this kind of problems, so what they showed is that in the two-armed bandit problem, if you do an algorithm where you maximize the information about what is the right arm, then you do good. Actually, no, then you do bad. If you maximize information about how much better is the right arm, then you do good. So this is just to point out, because I know that you've heard a lot about information, and this is a context where there's interesting work that will clarify things. So I think this is all I wanted to do for this. Okay, you get some pictures of intermittency. That's a low band filter. So you see the signal, the original one, and through the filter you see only the small scales, and you see that there are bursts all the time. So this is what we talked about. Okay, and then this, just to close on this whole far regime, large-scale regime, far from the source. This is a beautiful example of how biology deals with those kind of problems, right? This is famous because these moths are able to find the female from 100 meters distance, and the female emits picomolar per, I don't remember, picograms of pheromone per hour. Okay, so it's unimaginable. And then they manage from hundreds of meters away. So that's really in that situation. And you see something really cool, which is that this is the trajectory if you give the moth a smoothed signal. Okay, it's artificial because that's not what it's adapted for, and so it's very confused. So for us, for a computer, it would be easy, but for the moth, it's completely confusing. It's clearly adapted to a highly turbulent condition, because if you give it a turbulent plume of that kind, that for us is like super hard to deal with, then it goes straight to the source. Okay, so that's really cool. And this also occurs in the ocean for various creatures that are well adapted to turbulence. Okay, so we asked a simple question, which is the following. There's a lot of work on mice. Okay, so we'll switch to mice. Yes?
Are you going to define Infotaxes?
Are you going to define?
Are you going to define?
No, I'm not going to talk about it. I just mentioned it, but we can talk about it more if you want. Later, maybe. Okay? Okay, so there's a lot of work on mice. So this is a mouse. It's in a cage. It's transparent, actually. And there is an inlet and an outlet of air. Okay, and then in these 3 little mountains, we're giving it, there is a little tube that delivers odor. Okay, and we asked a very simple question. There's a lot of work on what's their sensory process and everything about the neurobiology of the system, but nobody has asked actually if they can use odor coming from the air. There's a lot of work on mice following traces, and they definitely do that. So the question we wanted to ask is, can mice find the source of an odor when the odor is delivered through the air? Okay, so it's not a trace. And here's just a movie, and they actually do, and now we want to quantify it. Okay? Okay, so this is the sketch of the problem, and what we are giving them is there are 3 possible sources of the odor, and there's water right nearby. They're thirsty, so they make the association. I find the odor, I get the water. Okay, and then we switch randomly from one source to another, so it doesn't know where it comes from. It needs to sniff and find it. Okay, and this is the temporal structure. There's for 20 seconds the odor and the water are on, and then there is an intertrial period of several seconds, which varies, so they don't have the clock in their mind. Okay, and and as I said, they get pretty good. So this is the performance measured in terms of time at target. So I told you, the target is on for 20 seconds. So the maximum they can stay there at is 20 seconds. And they don't get to 20, but they get to like 16 or 18 after 18 days of training, okay, which is a lot. And so then the question is, how do they do it? Okay, and we focus now for the next few slides, we'll focus on this guy. Okay, so in between day 4 and day 8, they clearly have already learned the association, and they're getting pretty good. Okay, in this image on the right, I'm just showing you another measure of performance that right now doesn't make too much sense to you, but just keep it in mind. And the question is, if I am, by chance, if I start from this position, can I, do I track directly the correct location, or do I check the wrong one first and then go to the right one? Okay? It's not immediately obvious whether this should be interesting, but we'll keep it. Yes?
Is the training done in the same box?
The same, what do you mean?
That's a transparent box, right?
It's just one box.
When you're training them, you train in that box.
Yeah.
And the same places of other.
Yes, correct. Okay, and so so they do get to the source of the odor using the odor in the air. Okay, and the question is, how do they do it? And these are numerical simulations of the odor in a realistic representation of our box. You see the 3 slices. This is from the top down, this is lateral, and this is also lateral from the other direction. Okay, so how does this look like to you with respect to everything we've talked about? Does this look like low Reynolds? No. Does it look like there's a lot of signal, or you're really far away from the source and you never get the signal? Is there a lot of signal? Is there very little? A lot of don't know. Okay, so we'll see. So it's definitely turbulent. It's large scales. The flow that comes in is 1 meters per second. The size of the inlet is like 10 centimeters. The size of the box is almost a meter. So it's definitely high Reynolds. Okay, it is turbulent because, as you can see, there is a spectrum minus 5/3. And remember, in a turbulent field, you have the spectrum. Okay? Great. So then, okay, here there is a little digression, which is the following. there are results that show you that, so what I'm doing here is I'm using those fields and try to see if just gradient climbing will get me there. Okay? And so how is gradient climbing defined? Gradient climbing is defined in the following way. I am a searcher and I start at some position, and then at the next step I'll move in the direction of the gradient of my signal. Okay, C is the concentration of my odor, and I'm just gonna make a step of constant length. Okay, and I'm gonna try and see what happens to this searcher. And now there's a theory about gradient climbing, okay, and the first thing that you need to have for gradient climbing to work is a convex function, right? If you have a convex function, then you are fine, okay? And there are results. I had planned to show you some demonstrations because there are some proofs, because they are nice to see at least once, but I think you'll see stuff of that kind, so I'm not gonna go into the details. So anyways, the bottom line is if you have a convex function, then this works. If you don't have a convex function, then there's no guarantee that you have one minimum, so you have no guarantees at all. So here you've seen the signal, right? So we definitely don't have a convex function, but we could assume that if we had an infinite time to wait and we could average in time, that would be a convex function. So my odor is coming from here, from the source. I'm going to sketch it. Does that make any sense? Sorry?
When you say convex function, which function is
The odor. C is the odor concentration, and the searcher is trying to find the maximum of that function, right? The source of the odor. Okay? And so if I had an infinite time, okay, and I would average C over and over and over, I would have some kind of convex function, right? Maybe not in this nice and this regular, but I would. The problem is I don't have an infinite time to average, and so what I'm gonna get is a stochastic estimate of this smooth gradient that gets me to the maximum of this nice convex function, okay? And there are results for that case too, okay, that tell you that in reasonable conditions you get to the source slower, so it's a little lousier, but you get there. Okay, and so my assumption when I walked into this field came from intuition from that case, and so I was doing this as the first step to just demonstrate that you'll never be able to use gradients at these scales. Just because I was biased, and I knew about that work, and I knew that at large scales you can measure gradients, and if you can, they're useless. Okay, and then I got this result, and I was puzzled. Okay, and then I did some work, and I came up with the picture that I gave you. Okay, so this is in reverse historical order. Now you're not particularly surprised, maybe, or are you surprised? Is this surprising to you that gradient climbing will get me there?
I was when I first saw it.
I was too, but now I gave you a lecture about the fact that you have fluctuating gradients, but you have the signal at small scales. The problems that are really hard and where gradients get you nowhere are these problems, and this is not one of those problems. Yes?
Is this a consequence of finiteness?
Sorry?
Is it just a consequence of finiteness? If you had an infinite span of, so let's just say if space was infinite, then it would just keep moving away, right?
Exactly. So the point of all of this is that there is a difference between, you have to do two things to get to the source. Number one, you need to find the plume, okay, to find the region of space where there is some odor, okay? And number two, then you have to find the source. Once you are within the plume, you're not going to leave it very easily. Like if you see, there are some instances where they escape, but they are not very often. So these two, so if you were in the infinite space, then it would be really hard to find the plume, and that's this situation here. You are in an infinite space. You have a very little signal. You don't know where the signal is. So it's really a hard problem, okay, computationally. This problem is hard because you have fluctuations, but it's easy to find the flume because you are in a finite domain. So eventually when you find it, then you get some signal. It's going to be fluctuating, but the gradient will get you somewhere. Okay, and so that's what I want to show you in the next few slides, that the gradient gets you somewhere. Yes?
If you were just moving randomly in that box, would you get to the...
You would eventually. A random walk in 2D will get you there, but it's pretty lousy.
Yeah, so it's much...
So never in 20 seconds. So So the answer is no in these time scales. Okay, so this is the performance of the algorithm and the two sources. It's harder to track this source, and it's easier to track this source, and we'll talk about it. Okay, they're not placed exactly symmetrically with respect to each other. Okay, we'll talk about it. And then I have the fraction of direct approaches. Remember, that's the other index that I'll use to measure performance. And I have a pretty high index of direct approaches that is comparable with that of mice. Okay, so remember here we are at early stages. So for the next few slides, let me show you something about why gradient climbing works. And the hell depends on whether you come from this lecture or not. Okay, so measure. I am here, I am a searcher, I'm trying to track that location. So this is the right direction that I would want to go to. Okay, this is the direction of the gradient that I happen to measure at that point in time and space. Okay, the gray line. And this is the angle between the two. So obviously, if that angle is small, maybe I'm not going there directly in a straight line, but at that step, I'm moving closer. So that's a good step. It's getting me close to the source. These instances, okay, this is another point in time and space, and at this instance, the gradient is really lousy. It's getting me away. Okay, so the question is, are small angles and large angles equally probable? Because in that case, there would be a random walker, right? And the numerical result is that they're not. Okay, this is the probability distribution of those angles, and it looks like small angles are more probable than large angles. The area, the yellow area is larger than the gray area. Okay, so this gives me a bias. Yes?
Have you tried changing the size of the box and seeing what the effect was?
Yes. Do I have it? So, how does this bias depend on the distance, right? I didn't change the size of the box, but I measured that bias as a function of the distance from the source. Okay, and does this make sense? Okay. So it does make sense in the sense that we have signal for almost the entire box. The box is slightly larger than this, okay? But at some point, the signal vanishes, okay? And what does it mean? It means that if you're far away from the source, gradients start to become completely useless. Okay, so this tells you the range where gradient climbing is useful to track the location of a source in a turbulent environment. And it will be, the number will depend on the details, of course. But it just tells you that the picture is consistent with our intuition that we just built on the board. Okay? Okay. What is what?
Red and blue curves.
Those are just the two sources. I'm just always, see, sometimes I track a source that is on that size, that I always use the red for the one on the left, and sometimes I track the other on the source on the other side. Okay, and I'll use it, I use the cyan, I think, the color. It will switch. I'll keep it, I'll let it go, yeah.
For that plot you had with the bias and it as a function of distance, the lines, like, it decreases and
this is very close to the source. So my sources are close to corners. So if you average, what did I do here? I calculated the bias at every location in space by averaging in time. And then I took my source and I draw a circle at distance r, and then I averaged. So if you're close, very close to the source, the circle makes it around it. So this is just a detail of the geometry of my problem. If I'm here, I can't make the circle anymore, and so things will be different on one side and the other, so it doesn't need to be perfect. The bottom line is, this is what interests me. When I'm far away from the source, at some point I lose completely interest in gradients. Yes?
Why do the mice even bother coming back to the initial starting point of your experiment?
Right, that's what I meant to say, and then I forgot. So we had 3 sources, but clearly one of the, right, yeah, here too we only have 2. Clearly, so the flow is coming from there, and this is the outlet. Okay, so there is a direction, and if when the odor comes from here, it's much harder to track because you're never downstream of it. Yeah, I mean, half of the time, most of the time you are not downstream. Okay, so we decided to analyze, after doing the experiments, so we have all of the experiments, but we decided to analyze those trajectories that happened to start from here, so they don't bother coming back here. We just pick the trajectories that randomly start from here. Okay, and we'll see why there are many trajectories that start from there. Okay? Okay, other questions? Okay, so this is the red one, and this is the green one, actually cyan. And the red one is, I think the red one, sorry. Okay, yes, that's what I remember. So the performance tells you that it's easier to track the green one, right? Correct? But then if we look at the bias and we can calculate it, it's not really clear that there is more signal in the green one. And in fact, if you do the average the entire space, the red one is slightly larger. The bias is slightly larger in the red one. Okay, remember, the bias is essentially the velocity, right? The effective velocity. I'm moving left and right, closer and further, but I have a slightly larger probability of getting closer, and that's the bias. Okay, so the larger the bias, the fastest I should be. Okay, so why is this not the case? Is the question clear? Okay. Okay, the reason why why the green is still easier, even if the right should have the larger velocities, is written somewhere there. Actually, here it's the pictorial view, and it's intermittency. Okay? The reason why the green one is easier is because I get the signal more often. Okay? So here is, so I didn't put the scale because it doesn't matter. This is a log plot of the odor in different locations in space. Okay, this is a time series. The x-axis is time. The y-axis is the logarithm of the odor. Okay, so when you see a vertical line, what does it mean? The log of the odor, vertical line. What does that mean? No odor, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so if I see vertical lines, it's because I suddenly didn't get the signal. So let's look at these boxes for a moment. Okay, the source in this case is right here. Okay, so when I'm at the source, I always get the signal. It fluctuates, of course, this is turbulent, but I always get it. Okay? And if I go downstream, these 5 boxes are all of the boxes downstream in here. I am pretty good. Like I have vertical lines, and see, it takes me some time to get the signal when I'm here, but after I get it, I always get it. Okay? Make sense? Same thing on the other side, right? This is the green source, and that's where the source is. You get the signal all the time, and then you go downstream, and it's pretty good. Okay, there are some discontinuities, but it's not that bad. Okay, and now I'm moving in this direction, right? So I'm showing you the same exact plot, but just not precisely downstream of the source. In fact, I chose the boxes that are at the boundaries between where the plume is and where there's just fresh air. And what you see is that you only see vertical lines. Yes? No, you didn't have a question. Okay. You only see vertical lines, so that means that you only get the signal sometimes. Again, this is consistent with all of the pictures and the intuition that we've built up, that if we are far away, then we'll get the signal only sometimes. And that's a mess. Okay? In fact, you can do this a little bit more quantitatively and see when is your first encounter, for example, when your source comes from one side or the other, and it looks like there's almost a second of difference, or yeah, a second. This is 4-3, that's 5-4, and that accounts for the reason why this is easier. So just to summarize, this is easier because I get the signal. Okay? The signal is weaker, but I get it. Make sense? Okay.
I missed the locations of the rewards. Are they symmetric?
They're not, of course.
So one is slightly towards the
Yes,
side.
we made this on purpose so we could statistically make a difference between the two. Otherwise, there should be no difference, right? So the fluid dynamics is not symmetric.
Okay, so even though it's more to the side, you will get a higher bias.
Yeah, because I think, so the higher bias it goes with, right? Because the higher bias means that it's more quiet. And the reason why it's more quiet, it's because here is the center line, so it's where the flow is dramatically fluctuating. So if you're more to the side, you're more quiet and right, less fluctuations. Okay, and now we'll go back to slide 1 of the lectures. Okay, so we were here. Okay, and I told you that gradient climbing is it's okay, and we understand why it works, although we didn't think it would initially. We've built up some intuition why this works. We are in a closed environment. There's a lot of signals, so we find the signal even if it fluctuates, it's fine. Okay, and then we keep going with this performance. We let the mice train for another 10 days, and we get to this point. And here they're even better. Okay? But there's something weird that happens, which is they get to the source super fast, but they get it wrong almost half of the time. Okay? Again, this is not a number that would matter to them. They only care about getting there as fast as possible. But once you realize you realize that they are much less accurate, and then the question is why. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter to them. So it's not a biological puzzle. It's a physical puzzle. It's an algorithm puzzle. It's a computational puzzle. What's happening? What's different in their behavior that makes it that although they're super fast, they get it wrong all the time? Okay? One would assume they're fast, they go there super fast. But in fact, they check the wrong location first a lot of the times. And this is even more interesting, and we'll see why this is interesting later. This is the number of pauses. Okay? So this makes sense because when they're late in training, so for the rest of the talk, late means late in training. It's between day 14 and 18. It's when they're super fast but inaccurate, okay? And when they're super fast and inaccurate, they don't pause much, okay? They act, but they don't think much. Okay, and so this was our, actually, that was too quick. Do you have ideas? Sorry, I showed you the answer in the next slide, so maybe some of you didn't see it, so do you have ideas? Yes?
So maybe the mouse is also doing some time integration when it's pausing to accumulate the signal. That maybe can take away some of the fluctuation.
That is brilliant. It turns out in these conditions, it never pays to average. You should just go because you don't have enough time to average to a reasonable point, and you're losing time because you're not moving. Right? But that's a brilliant point. Yes?
It doesn't even care about the gradient anymore and just walks to check the corners.
Check the corner. Okay, why? What corner, and why would it check the corner?
Because it was always in one of the two corners.
Great. Yes. So can you tell me? Well, no. I'll tell it. I'll say it for you. Okay. So we've trained them for 14 days, and they're mice, but still they're smart. And so initially they have no idea where the sources are, and this is our pictorial view. And we start to train them, and they explore space. This is kind of like the space covered by their trajectories, because they don't go everywhere. They still explore a subsection of the entire space. But they explore kind of a lot. And then little by little, they just realize that there are only 3 sources, so there's no point in exploring the entire space. And most importantly, there's no point in sensing. Right? It's not about the trajectory, it's about decision. They don't want to make decisions. If you have to drive to work every day, you're not going to think, oh, what road could I take today, right? I mean, you get up, you get dressed, and you leave, and you don't make any decision, you just go. And that's what we think they do. Okay, so there is a transition driven by experience that starts you from sensation, pure sensation. You need the odor because you've no idea where these things are. And then eventually, with enough experience, you get rid of sensation, which is hard to do, and you just use memory. Okay? So this is the way we wanted to try and confirm this. If this is true, then, okay, change the situation at this point. Okay? Change the locations of the source. What should happen? What do you think should happen? Train mice for 14 days on a certain triplet of locations. And then at day 18, when they're like waking up and just, getting dressed and driving, then change the locations of their office, right? What are they going to do? What do you think? Sensing again. Okay. Okay, and so this is our plot. So this curve means that we use another set of mice. Okay, we train them on a different set of locations, and then at day 18 we switch the locations to the 1, 2, 3 that we used for the first set of mice. Okay, so we're now comparing performance for these 2 sets of mice on the same locations, but the green ones, the moved, have been trained on a different set of locations. Make sense? Okay. And one important thing that you see here is performance is identical. Okay? So it's not about speed. They can get there anyway. It's not about the reward. It's something about behavior. How do they get there? And so this is the plot that really convinced us that they're switching back to sensation. And the reason is, so this is the first set of mice. Actually, no, because it's not identical to the other. This is the second set of mice, the green, Okay, they've habituated to their locations ABC. Okay, they've become really inaccurate, and then we switch the locations to 1, 2, 3. Okay, the original set of locations that I showed you, and instantly they regain accuracy. Make sense?
Why is their performance so good? Is it because the sources are still close by and they get put into the high signal place? Or?
I think that this points to the fact that the reason why performance is so slowly increasing is because they are making associations. They're learning the map of space. Remember, we started with that experiment. They have a map of space. I think this is not something algorithmic about finding the source. It's something else. It's a combination of you are learning the task, you're learning the environment, and then once you have that, changing the sources means you have to just adjust your algorithm, but you know what your goal is. You know the task. So I think that's what
I mean, the sensing is always as good as it can be. It's just that they need to understand what they are.
So the comparison between these two and saying that they have the same performance means that you have alternatives to get to the source as fast in both cases. Okay? These two sets of mice get to the source in the same time frame. Okay? But they are doing it differently. So it's important that it's the same reward, because if the reward level was different, you could imagine that there are things that are driven by the reward. But this is not reward driven, it's behavior driven. It's just the way they do it, not how good they are. They can be as good, but they have a choice. Okay, maybe in the next couple of slides it will be easier. Okay, the second thing I showed you is pauses. Okay, and this is another thing that brings the point, which is if you're just going over and over from one source to the next because you know where they are, you don't need to pause to process information, to make decisions. Okay, if you are sensation driven, so if you need to sniff the odor, process how strong is it, how much did I get before, where should I go, that takes computational time, so cognitive time. And so it's been showed over and over in different situations that any task that's cognitively demanding will display a number of pauses that's higher. So the pauses in behavior correspond to cognitive load. So again, this is another indication that maybe you have the choice between these two behaviors, and you choose this one just because it's easier. You don't have to think, right? And it's cool because this is completely quantitative, so we could test how cognitively demanding something is by just measuring pauses.
How many trials do they do per day?
Maybe 40. I hope I wrote it because otherwise I don't remember. But yeah, after a while you have to stop because they get bored. 40 trials a day. Yeah, for rats it's like after 5 you have to stop because they are super smart, so they don't feel like keeping doing the same thing.
But it still takes so long to reach, like 2 weeks to reach.
Yeah, it's still pretty long, that's true. But remember that it's not the entire thing that takes so long. I think there's some part of it, and I don't know how much, that is driven by environment. They are in far light, so they don't see anything, so they have to really get adjusted to the environment and learn the task. So
Do you think they're just learning about the entire environment? Like maybe it just takes time, like they're always taking some time to just learn the environment?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's it.
So
Because
if you make the environment more complicated, you put like distractor objects that don't have odors, you expect the slope to be longer maybe?
I would guess shorter because the landmarks will help you build a map of space faster. One thing that we have done is put these odor distractors. So things that will release the same odor that will mask the signal. And that makes it considerably harder, of course. Okay, so I just want to conclude So these are quantitative comparisons that, again, show that there is this transition between bias, so prior, driven by experience, and sensation. And maybe I won't go through it because I want to just show you how these things could be generalized, potentially. Okay, so these are movies. Okay, so this is a giant Pacific octopus. So the tank is pretty big. It's not tiny, but it's a juvenile, but it's a big animal. And so what you see here is that, I don't know if it's clear, but there is a prey, okay? And the octopus is getting the prey. And the way it's doing it is I find it fascinating, which is that it spends some time sensing the environment, and then it gets there without having to move slowly, to approach it. It's not like it's not a slow approach. It's a one shot. Okay, and so that means that this animal is able to infer the location of the prey in one shot from a distance. Okay, and they're formidable predators. So they do this all the time, apparently. What do they use and how do they do it? It's part of this set of problems that I find fascinating. Specifically for octopus, there is one additional twist, which is very interesting, which is that the brain of the octopus contains 30% of the neurons of the nervous system. The rest is in the arms. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence that many behaviors are controlled locally. So this is a kind of like collective behavior, but within a single organism, where the problem is computationally super well defined. Find the prey. Okay, the signal comes from the fluid. It's odor and it's pressure. The sensors are distributed along the arms, and the decision, it's unclear if it's made locally or globally. So the interaction between these different degrees of freedom is something that we're starting to work on, and please go talk to Nicola, whom I don't know where he is because he has a poster on this. And by the way, this is an important message of the slide. This is all experiments that David is doing at Seattle and Friday Harbor, and he's great. So find cool collaborators. It's an important message, I think. Okay, this is another movie, and I'll conclude with this. Same animal, same tank. There's just one slight difference that you are going to tell me what it is. But look at the behavior and describe it to me. Is it doing the same thing that I showed you in the other movies? And here's the prey, the poor thing. She doesn't know.
It's not hungry anymore.
It's not hungry. That's possible, but it's repeatedly. We've seen it repeatedly, so it's not about that. Same thing or different? It looks very different. It keeps moving, it senses, but it's not, it doesn't go, right? And what do you think is the difference in the condition? There is one important difference. Although it seemed minor, but it's not apparently. It's, yeah, almost, yes, correct. So the proposal is he's blind. So he's not blind, he's not been blinded, but the difference is David has a tank which is at, I think, ground level, and he did the previous experiments in dim red light. Okay, so assuming he wouldn't be able to see anything, and probably doesn't see much. But this is when he put the tank like somewhere 2 or 3 floors underground, and it was super well controlled, and it was far red light or something. And the behavior changes completely. And so now we are trying to understand what is it. So is it that he goes directly just because he sees the prey, or which I favor, and I hope, because the vision is boring to me. But there's this other possibility that he's confused because complete dark, so octopus, there are different species of octopuses that are adapted to different light conditions. And so being in a completely unnatural environment might confuse the octopus because it's unnatural. So he might just be weirded about it. And I favor that because now I'll show it again. And don't you think it looks like he's confused about, yeah.
So you're going to write an equation for a weirded out octopus?
Yeah, I think so. Well, right now we're trying to find out what it is. But if it's that it's been weirded, then yeah, I might try. We'll see. Okay, that was the end of it. So thank you.
So you basically told us that animals cheat when they can.
Yes.
Right?
Well, we cheat too.
Well, we're animals.
Yeah.
Okay.